I just want drama-free 25 gigabit networking. Is that so much to ask? The number one best thing about the ECS aggregation switch from Ubiquiti is that it's a Marvell chipset. It's not Broadcom, it's Marvell. And then there's like items 2 through 6, which make it amazing. And then like somewhere around item number 11 is from Ubiquiti. It's a UniFi Enterprise. Enterprise. This has been one of the longest reviews that I've been working on because there's a lot of stuff that was broken. But finally now, firmware 3.0, it's awesome. I can't fault Ubiquiti too much for that because they said, all right, you found some bugs in some of our other gear. Why don't you help test this? And I have been. And now it's basically fine. But let's take a look at this and let's take a look at the review because right now at the time that I'm doing this video, this aggregation switch is 48 25 gigabit SFP28 ports plus 600 gig ports. It's Marvell's answer to Broadcom domination. And Marvell's chipset is actually pretty good. And some of the things that I might be complaining about on the Ubiquiti side really have to do with compromises that were made by Marvell. And well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's dive in. Let's do the review. Let's unpack this because it actually works pretty well now. And Ubiquiti calls this an aggregation switch, but I think this also makes a perfectly fine 25 gigabit workstation workgroup switch as well at this point in 2025. That was not always true. If you tried one of these things before about July 2025, you probably have an entirely different opinion. And that's okay. We'll talk about that. So, we'll start with a quick unpack. In the box, you get the rails. That's on an extra charge. Whoops, that's pretty awesome. You've also got a little box with the hardware kit. Don't miss that. Some of the mounting accessories and that sort of thing. And then you get the switch. I've already been in here, so it's, a little dinged up. Don't look too much into that. Now, while it does come with rails, it does not come with a redundant power supply. You're going to have to order that on your own. And speaking of redundancy, if you just use like Cisco or Dell or HP's, network planning consultant thingy, whenever you're building out like your core switching infrastructure, they always recommend dual switches. And I recommend that as well. Like a 2-pack. And I think Ubiquiti could sell a 2-pack with a slight discount and encourage people to buy these as a 2-pack. Because a lot of the time your dual 25 gig NICs or your dual 100 gig NICs, 2 ports, 1 port into each switch. Now, this is 48 ports, and in the internal backplane switching bandwidth, it does have some limitations. And so, like, if you run dual port and you're going to run 2 connections to the switch from each workstation for a redundant path, that's fine. But like I say, I think you're better off with 2 switches and like switch failover, especially if they're that important, unless you're using this as a workgroup switch. If you're using this as a workgroup switch, then it's probably okay. Although if your entire workgroup goes down and then that's problematic, then again, think in terms of dual switches. Ubiquiti doesn't really necessarily encourage you to do that, but understand that if you were looking at any other enterprise solutions and any other configurators, they really do that. And like Dell, for example, they have the switches that are 1U like this, but it's a chassis that's physically split down the middle where one side is one physical separate switch and the other side is another physical separate switch. And you have your own connection between the switches. And they do that for redundancy so that each workstation has a connection to its own physical switch. And that is your failover should a switch die to keep everything running. You gotta, I figure if you're thinking about this kind of a solution versus something that is purely command line managed and purely enterprise managed, you might not think about these things. You should. Hang out in the level 1 forums. That said, this thing has some cool features. Anyway, let's get that pesky redundant power supply. Hilariously, this has more margin than that. Like, really, did we need all this packing material? Yes, and it is a Ubiquiti branded power supply, because of course it is. Hey, it's still less handsy with the money than Cisco. Look at this fancy cape, like the power supply cable feels super designer. I would also point out that the power supply cable that comes with the switch isn't a fancy braided kind. It's just a regular old normal power supply. The other braided cable is to make you feel good about having spent way too much on that second power supply. But you need it. You got to have it. And the price of the package, still pretty good. Ubiquiti added RGB to some of their switches. Again, they're targeting a demographic. Don't be the demographic. The measure of a good switch is, does it do the switching and get out of the way? And is it super easy to use? And is the software amazing? And there are things here that the enterprise customers could learn from. RGB is not one of them. Although it is fun. I mean, it's fun. It's a fun little feature. I might warm to it. Anyway, let's take a look at this and see what you're getting yourself into. Now, for setting these up, if you're not familiar, the UniFi software is pretty good. If you have a wireless network already, and from the wireless network, the switches will be reachable, you can download an app and configure this from an iPhone or an Android phone, or you can download the UniFi software and run that on Linux as long as it's on an x86 host, or Mac OS or Windows. That control software gives you a web GUI, which is very slick and polished and pretty awesome. I don't really need to get into the details of the software for this video. It's pretty intuitive, and if you've managed Ubiquiti access points before, you're probably going to be familiar with the software. And you can go into the switch configuration, you see these switches, you can adopt them. Everything's all good there. The first problem that I ran into was when the switches are named the same thing, it seems to get stuck adopting the second one. So I named the first switch ECS Aggregation 2 Electric Boogaloo, even though it's the first one, the primary one. In an ideal world, you will have two connections to the internet, two redundant connections to the internet. That can even be two of your security gateways. Yeah, Ubiquiti sells security gateways. And so you can have two security gateways to your ISP, redundant connections from your ISP. And that way, if a switch dies, again, you have a path all the way out your network, all the way to the internet, whatever. Once you've got the switches adopted, both of them, the GUI is very well put together and very polished. As a matter of management, I recommend that when you're using those dual port adapters, that like port 1 on the first switch, on the top switch, and port 1 on the bottom switch, go to the same network card. Don't do like port 1 and port 37. I mean, you can do that in the GUI, but I just don't recommend that. It doesn't make sense. For AirStornado, with its dual 100 gig network card, well, that's one port into the top switch, one port into the bottom switch, and then you configure the in lag, and you're good to go. Of course, you have to configure the lag on the Stornado side as well. But that is what enables us to get peak 20 gigabytes per second from our Stornado. It's very fast, blisteringly fast, because again, it's all flash storage. So yeah, it was like 7.4 gigabytes per second. Don't blink or you'll miss it. For our other 45 drive storage chassis that has mechanical hard drives, it too has a 2-port network, but it's ConnectX-5 dual 25 gig, but one port into each switch. Now, in case you're wondering, yeah, that is 2 Ubiquiti crossover cables, or, well, that's not really a crossover cable. Those are bridge cables, QSFP28, short copper DAC. That's 200 gigabit between the switches. 200 gigabit doesn't seem like a lot to have a connection between each switch, but really it's just the control messages that are going between the switches. Unless there's a failure, like a failure of a port or a failure of an optic, you're really not going to have very much traffic between the link between these two switches, because it is an active pathway for data. Both of the connections between devices are always going to be saturated, but generally traffic is not going to travel across the link between switches. It's really just a control plane, and that's also where some of the bugs can crop in. So things like, that's weird, the ping time went from 0.01 milliseconds to 3 to 5 milliseconds. Chances are it's something that has gone wrong with spanning tree or switch configuration, or there's something going on in the synchronization daemon between the two switches. If you run top and you're looking at the CPU utilization on the switches since firmware 3.0, when it's in MC lag, CPU utilization is kind of high. It's like 60% all the time. And it looks like it's the sync daemon running the sync between the switches. Nevertheless, as long as you're not tripping over any of those bugs, this configuration does work, and it does work well. Look at those iPerf numbers. It's very, very fast. If this sounds like I'm completely speaking a foreign language, but you're in charge of a network that needs something like this, the GUI here, you'd be hard-pressed to find a GUI that is more well put together. There was maybe some hope that this kind of thing was going to come from Juniper. They have some stuff like this on the access point side of things, where it's really slick point-and-click interface. There are some GUIs like this on the Aruba side from HP, but VMware generally is in the mix because you're configuring your network on the VMware side. As a standalone product, the UI for this is basically top-notch. Do note some of the bugs that you can trip over are bugs that are just in the GUI. So it's still worth learning how to manipulate these switches from SSH. And when you SSH in, you do get kind of a gnarly warning that says, don't do it this way. But when I've been troubleshooting and figuring out problems like forward error correction or like OSFP problems and things like that, I've had better luck understanding what was happening at the command line level, at the SSH level, because the GUI doesn't always reflect the state of reality on the switch. Just something to keep in mind. Okay, so storage testing, is it really that simple? Is it really that plug and play? This is a ConnectX 4 card, Mellanox, and this is a different brand chipset than the chipset that's in the Switch. That's okay, but that's also some of the rough edges. Like, you'll have an easier time with a Marvell chipset, I think. But ConnectX 5 is still, like, to give you an idea, the AI servers, they're like a ConnectX 8, I think, at this point, ConnectX 7 or 8. ConnectX 5 is fine. ConnectX 4 is okay, but getting a little long in the tooth. ConnectX 3 and older are too old. You can maybe get away with ConnectX 3 on a server in like a Linux machine context, but we're using a Stornado from 45 drives. This is a flash-based chassis. This is a really awesome powerhouse storage server that is designed to hold 16 flash drives. Well, they have some other different chassis configurations, but 16 high-performance, high-speed flash drives. Each one of these can do 8 gigabytes per second. Pulling from the chassis, you can run north of 20 gigabytes per second, at which point you're bottlenecked by a dual 200 gig connection. But notice, 2 100 gig connections. That makes sense with the multi-chassis aggregation, the MC multi-chassis, that's what that means. And so you can run one to one Ubiquiti chassis and the other one to another Ubiquiti chassis. You could use a single chassis and just take 200 gig connections into a single switch. But here's the thing. If you're just using this as file shares, or you're using this like a workgroup switch, which is, I think, the highest, best, and most reliable function for the ECS campus aggregation switch, if you have 2 switches, you don't even really have to configure lag. You can actually use your 2 25 gig interfaces on your workstation card, which is what I have here on our Falcon Northwest workstation, and use those as independent connections. SMB multi-channel means that Windows will automatically use both of these connections to get a double link back to the file server. And that works fine with SMB multi-channel enabled on the Linux side of things. And yes, you can actually achieve, 4.5 gigabytes per second on a network card like this with no extra special configuration. Now, if you want to do jumbo frames and lots of extra special configurations and really get your hands dirty and learn, this is a great platform for that. But as this is what I would call entry-level enterprise, and maybe you don't have experience with those things and you just want it to be plug and play, if you work toward the SMB multi-channel and a little bit less on the actual, like multi-channel link aggregation special features, you're going to have an easier time with this setup and platform, and it will basically be plug and play. Like at this point in 2025, if you want to use 25 gigabit over 2 gigabytes per second file transfers in Windows, it's basically plug and play with any network card better than a ConnectX 4 level or better. And so that's what the magic here is that like 10 gig is basically obsolete. Like this is the chef's kiss of just let 10 gig go, move on to 25 gig and 50 gig and beyond. Like, and by the way, this is really a 25 gig switch. It's not really, it's a 100 gig switch, but you can do 100 gig, there are 600 gig ports on it, but really it's a 25 gig. They could have made it just all 25 gig ports and then given you the option to aggregate, some of the port groups, because you can use breakout cables to do, 100 gig to 25 gig, whatever. But it's not bad for what it is. Like for the cost and for the features, and even if you're all in with the extra power supplies and other accessory cables, and it's a $5,000 solution per switch, let's say, and that's perhaps a bit of an overestimate. To be all in, 10 grand to have this kind of failover and multi-chassis link aggregation, basically okay. And a cool little touchscreen and some diagnostic tools and a pretty slick user interface that mostly works fine, then this is still a really, really good deal for what it is. Just know that there are some limitations of what you're getting into. And I really hope that Ubiquiti sort of continues down this path, for the 1.0 product. We really need another player in the game like Ubiquiti building solutions around non-Broadcom chipsets. IMHO. The out-of-the-box experience when it first shipped. 404, page not found. Credit where credit is due. Ubiquiti lets you download the firmware without registering or doing anything, which is fantastic. And at the time that I'm doing this video, there's 3.0.0, which still has some bugs, but there's a beta, and the bugs that I'm going to complain about are fixed from the 3rd of July of 2025. And then there's also 2.1.9, which actually has less bugs in some scenarios, but really, like, the firmware from 2.1.9 to 3.0 was supposed to resolve spanning tree and kind of an advanced version of spanning tree and failover, and like really being able to run that dual switch configuration. There are a lot of things that are fixed in 3.0, but none of that stuff is actually fixed and is worse in 3.0. And so if you need like RTSP or spanning tree, or you have it seems like the DAC compatibility is also worse, because I've got all kinds of like enterprise cast-off stuff, old color chip adapters, and like crossover cables, old Cisco stuff. The 2.1.9 firmware seems like it had better compatibility with that stuff. And there's weird things that happen with those. Like, it's not just a work doesn't work thing with the DAC. You can run into things that, like, the Cisco DAC, for some reason, with firmware 3.0, increases from like less than 1 millisecond of latency to like 3 to 5 milliseconds of latency for traffic that passes through that. And I don't understand why that would be. It doesn't happen with 2.1.19, but does happen with 3.0, but is fixed in the 3.0 beta firmware. So I also like this aspect of Ubiquiti's firmware very much. I'm just pasting a link. Oh, gotta quote it. Hope I didn't break it. Invalid firmware. That's not great. But it is because we're on, the dawn of time. We're trying. Okay. We're going to try to do this manually, because the firmware is too old. Let's see. I don't know. Yeah, that's what you want to see. Worrying. Now, to be sure, the firmware has bugs. There's a lot of bugs. But, Ubiquiti unfairly gets a few bugs assigned to it. So when this system was first set up with the 1.3 firmware, which you run into sometimes, which, by the way, upgrading the firmware like that doesn't work. It doesn't work through the GUI. If you get old stock that has the 1.3 firmware, which has popped up a couple of times, it showed up in our forum. I got a retail one. Like, I've got like 3 or 4 of these switches floating around right now, and it's a whole other thing. Anyway, firmware 1.3, you got to manually update it, and that is the update to command for the shell sys wrapper.sh. Update 2 is like you copy the firmware to /tmp. That's how you do it. Anyway, it would be baffling and frustrating because when you go in and out of different firmware versions, there are different defaults. And right now on port 49, I have it connected upstream to our Broadcom chipset Dell switches, which have their own set of problems, to be sure. I run Dell Oni as well as the Sonic firmware, and we have one of the guides for getting Sonic up and running. And so if you look at the configuration here, it's also really frustrating sometimes too, because you'll configure the forward error correction mode, which is 9 times out of 10 why it doesn't link and why things aren't working. You'll configure the forward error correction mode. You can set it to none, or you can set it to FC or RS. But really, it is only CL91RS that is supported at 100 gigabit. So you really only have a choice of CL91RS or none. You could set other forward error correction modes in older firmware, and of course the PHY adapters don't really care. It just depends on the age of them. And so if you update the firmware, then all of a sudden you can't get link. And sometimes that is Ubiquiti's fault. But in this case, it was not Ubiquiti's fault. You can configure the peer to have no forward error correction at 100 gigabit, and then configure Ubiquiti to have no forward error correction and get your link back. But sometimes when you update these things, you will lose link unless you really are paying attention to the port mode and the peering port mode. That also translates to problems like spanning tree. So like if your PHYs are going up and down, and it's like, oh, the spanning tree is going crazy, and it's like, well, it's because of that. If you have one side configured for no forward error correction and the other side configured for forward error correction, you can get into a link flapping situation, especially like it's going up and down, especially when you're mixing the Marvell and the Broadcom chipsets. This is a very important and subtle thing to understand. This is not quite as plug and play as 25 gig and 100 gig. And that's sort of the thing that, you know, for enterprise grade, when you're buying Ubiquiti stuff, you don't necessarily have all of the enterprise experience and understand just how command line and manual configuration this kind of thing can be. Like when you're deploying, you know, if you're an all Cisco shop or you're all Aruba or whatever, they hide a lot of these things from you. But some of these standards have changed over time. To be sure, 100 gigabit is basically pedestrian in higher end enterprise data centers. 100 gigabit is sort of the entry level. It's the 10 gigabit that you're probably thinking of today. 200 gig, 400 gig, 800 gig is more typical. Although, you know, consider also that Mellanox dominates all this, and we got to talk about Mellanox adapters into a non Broadcom type situation for some of these higher link speeds, because there are older adapters and that sort of thing. And the Ultra Ethernet consortium and like how that has standardized at faster speeds has trickled down. Kind of like 10 gig. Like there's 10 gig / 40 gig, and that's like the old crappy standard and is not really fabulous. And then the new 10 gig standard is like actually 1, 2.5, 5, 10 gig. And there are important physical and subtle differences for that. And that leads to, you know, from 10 gig to 25 gig a lot cleaner than the old 1 gig / 10 gig stuff, which is actually a lot of suffering and terribleness. If you are interested in the multi-chassis aggregation, you can use it. There are some landmines, but basically it's okay. And like, there's really advanced options here too. Sonic. This is based on an operating system called Sonic, which really is part of Open Compute. And that's part of how Ubiquiti is able to leverage some of the stuff here, like because Open Compute lean into the enterprise thing and that sort of thing. And so it is really encouraging to see Ubiquiti, you know, like leaning on and using open source. But check this out. Docker. Docker's running on the compute part of the switch. Understand that the architecture of the switch is based on that Marvell chipset, and the Marvell chipset is doing the heavy lifting. And then you have a computer that's controlling what's going on with the chipset. The computer tells the chipset, okay, these ports are on a VLAN, and this is how this goes together, and so on and so forth. The interesting thing is when you take two switches, you stack them, you connect the 100 gig ports together, and then for those dual port 25 gig cards I was showing you, you connect one port to one switch and the other port to the other switch. And the traffic doesn't really cross the switches. You have some control traffic that crosses the switches, but really you've only got that, 200 gig link, let's say, if you're using two ports between the switches, and so that'll bottleneck. Switches are advertised as having 1.6 terabits of internal switching capacity, but with the multi-chassis link aggregation and everything working correctly, then one channel on one switch, one channel on the other switch, you get nice failover, the control stuff works fine. This is a really neat feature of Marvell's chipset and a pretty good implementation in the underlying Sonic software, which is part of Open Compute. And the fact that Ubiquiti is leaning on Sonic to do this, I think is a great thing. It's a fantastic thing versus inventing their own firmware and their own software. It's just that sometimes the alignment between the open source thing and the not open source thing is not super aligned. And, for Ubiquiti's part of it, if they fix things or they find bugs in Sonic or they do stuff, then that's going to be a competitive disadvantage for them because somebody else can take the software and run with it and then build a better chassis. We're back in the lab, and I've got my file share off the Stornado pulled up. This right here, this is worth the price of admission. I'm copying a 26 gigabyte language model file at 2 gigabytes per second, just with a single 25 gigabit link. And it was plug and play. I put the card in, Windows automatically detected the driver, did not have to configure anything. And that's what we're shooting for here, that level of ease. Like, I'm just going to run the network card at 25 gigabit, and it's basically plug and play, and nothing special is required. Once upon a time, 10 gig was special, and you had to use jumbo frames and all this stuff, but computers are so fast now, and the bus is so fast, and the network cards are so fast that 25 gig really is the entry point. Now, if you want to move to 50 gig, dual link 25 gig, 100 gig, then yeah, it still makes sense to jump through and do some special configuration, jumbo frames, do some things so that you get more CPU offloading, RDMA. There's a whole gateway toward networking adventures that you're going to embark on. But that's not the purpose of this video. The purpose of this video is to show you the low-hanging fruit options for 25 gig networking and beyond, because 25 gig needs to be ubiquitous, pun intended. You want to link up your Jetson Thor at 100 gigabit? You totally can do it. I know what you're thinking. There's not a redundant connection. How am I going to connect it to both switches? It's actually 4 25 gig channels, so you connect 2 25 gig channels to each switch, and that still counts as link aggregation. And so you have 50 gigabit into each physical switch, and that's how you deal with the single QSFP 28 connection on Jetson Thor, but you still have a redundant path. It's pretty awesome, huh? Okay, good news. The 3.02 firmware is out. It's going to fix all the bugs, right? No, actually, it didn't fix any of the bugs and actually introduced some new bugs. Multi-chassis aggregation is broken. It was broken for me in the lab. I have 2 of these in the field, and we did a field upgrade, but I had rearranged things because of the problems here. And it also broke in the field upgrade. I talked to some other people that are using these in the field, and they also experienced problems and multi-chassis aggregation failure and some other problems. And so the 3.02 firmware still has a lot of bugs, and there's still a lot of landmines, so don't just blindly move to it. You might want to pay attention to the Ubiquiti platform, firmware, all this other kind of stuff. Even despite all those warts, this platform still has less lock-in and is less proprietary than your other options that you're looking for, 25 and 100 gigabit. You can get a reasonable experience from like a Dell switch with a perpetual license, but I don't think that those options are fundamentally in your best interests, even though this has a lot of... You have to understand that there's a war in Mount Olympus when we're talking about networking. You have giant companies like, Meta and Google and Amazon that are buying this gear, or they're not even buying this gear, they were buying this gear years ago at scale, and now they're buying faster stuff. And they don't want to get locked into proprietary stuff. But you have the people that are doing the engineering here that are dead set on locking in customers. Look at what's happening with VMware and the Broadcom aspect. It's like you and I, the blue collar, the boots on the ground folks that have to deal with the fallout from that. That is happening and been happening from a networking perspective for a long time, and Broadcom's also involved in some of that. Broadcom's doing amazing, innovative things technologically, but they're also they have Machiavellian interests in terms of building their business empire and things like that. This, not a Broadcom chipset. The chipset is good. The software is also in the right direction of what Ubiquiti should do. This hood, this the switch under the hood, understand, is fundamentally different than any other switch that Ubiquiti has done. So this is a little bit of a risk for them, and I think it's why it's taken them so long to update the firmware, and part of why this video has been so long coming. But this is the right direction that Ubiquiti has to go. They have to do the engineering, they have to do the integration, they have to lean on open compute, and there's a ton of resources they can pull from the open source and quasi-open source thing to build a solid foundation that doesn't involve lock-in. And there are a lot of customers that are very, very aware of this and very, very tired. At the same time, those customers need 5 nines of reliability. There has to be engineering, rollback, failover, and mechanisms in place so that, you're guaranteed that an optic that works today will also work tomorrow, or that you have a management path into the switch, probably a little bit of an oversight not having a gigabit copper port on the back, because it seems like it has one internally, to be able to do management and that sort of thing, and the little mistakes and problems with the firmware. But the little mistakes and problems with the firmware in this switch is the direction Ubiquiti should go in all of their other switches, because these kinds of firmware issues and bugs are not new to this product from Ubiquiti, and it's not new to like entire product families with Ubiquiti. This is kind of the experience with Ubiquiti at the bleeding edge. But if you do your testing and do all your other stuff, you can make it work. And the price point is extremely aggressive for the enterprise stuff. So this is also like an encouragement to Ubiquiti. Like, they can do a lot here. There's a lot of excitement from customers. This is not the end of the world. But you're gonna have to get somebody like us on the ground helping you earnestly evaluate these things in these products. And I hope to see the 10 gig / 25 gig switch adopt the same kind of stuff under the hood, better management, a little closer to a Linux experience, not Ubiquiti's operating system, Sonic chipset, lean more on open compute. AMD and Pensando, this is some of the things that, like, philosophically, this is what AMD has in mind for their Ultra Ethernet, because networking is going to become basically just a PCIe fabric, and Ubiquiti can be right there to handle you know, like a small lab, medium lab kind of stuff, because I mean, they are a multi-billion-dollar company. They can do it. But for right now, that's all the warts and everything that you should know for this product, good and bad. I still think it makes a hell of a great work group switch, and if you are in a position to be able to use your brain and work around the kinds of things you're likely to encounter, it's still really good. If you want to set and forget it, top of rack, you know, aggregation switch for your campus, that you're gonna be paying a lot more, but it's, you know, probably something else. But this is still a good product, and this is still the direction Ubiquiti should go, and this is still where Ubiquiti should double down on the product, because there is a huge gap in the market for that. So yeah, it's been interesting. It's been an interesting journey. Let's chat more about this on Wondless Level 1. You can find me in the Level 1 forums. You know, maybe I'll be doing another video when there's another firmware update, because this has been a long time coming. All right, I'm signing out, and I'll see you there.